Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another session of ClearView Convos. I'm your host, Sam Ulin. Thrilled to have folks here. And today I'm joined by two of my colleagues who I think go about as deep as anybody in how platform technologies can really go broad and how you manage that potential as an organization when you are capital and human bandwidth restrained. So within that, I'll introduce my colleagues, Debbie Zhuang and Matt Murphy. Debbie, you want to say a brief introduction?
Yeah, happy to. So Debbie Zhuang, a partner out of our Boston office, do a ton of work with biotech companies, often local to us. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And Matt Murphy, a principal, also working out of Boston, do a lot of work with both early stage companies as well as larger biotech and pharma, thinking about how to approach the platform space. Really love working with new, exciting technologies, especially around genetic medicine, rare disease, oncology. So really excited for the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you both for joining. And maybe Matt, the first question to you, part of the lifeblood of our industry is innovative technologies, right? Like historically we had small molecules and antibiotics, and then we figured out, oh, you know what? We can steal the immune system and make an antibody and have it target specific things. And that continues to lead to explosions in innovation. Oh, thank goodness someone tried mRNA and 38 things that didn't work because it was too immune triggering. It saved the entire world from a massive pandemic. So, tell me more. Like when you consult with someone who's got one of these new technologies, it can do anything. Where do you start, and how do you even think about deciding what you actually do with something that's so potent and so broad in applications?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we have to face that challenge a lot of times with clients that are developing new technologies. And I think one of the key pieces to understand upfront, right, it all starts with a strong understanding of what the technology is and how it's different from all the other approaches that other folks are taking in the space. And I think one of the keys to success early on is making sure to distinguish what is technically possible with a novel platform versus where are you actually meaningfully differentiated from what others are attempting to do, whether that's expectations for significant improvements in efficacy or safety or unlocking new targets in a way that maybe have not been able to be addressed by historical modalities. So really using that to kind of start out by setting up a list of disease features, whether that's based on the genetics, the biology, what pathways are involved, and then kind of feeding into the degree of unmet need, right? What treatments are available, how well do they work, and understanding a little bit about the competitive landscape to think through, right? What can we do, and then what should we do, and where the most attractive options going to be based on right where we think we're the most differentiated. Through all this, need to account not just for how historical modalities and approaches have fared in some of these diseases, but also think about kind of how the competitive landscape in the platform space has really continued to accelerate in recent years, and we're seeing, I think, a shortening of the time between right the first platform company launching in a space and several more companies with related technologies launching soon thereafter, and then a second gen and a third coming kind of right behind. So always having to be thoughtful about what those other companies may be doing or may try to do, not because you want to be afraid of what the second and third gen version of the product might do, but just really focusing in on where you think the value story for the company and the platform is going to be the strongest over the long term.
Yeah, Matt, maybe to double click, it's helpful the way you framed it. And I guess, one of the challenges you're always wrestling with, right, is where's my technology most likely to work from a biological perspective? And that's both like it could be target tissue, target cell type, which is not even a disease specific thing. And then it can be both payload itself. What am I actually delivering to that functional tissue, and how likely is that to work? And then you got to juxtapose that against how do I actually show that it works in the clinic, where there's questions around what are the endpoints, like, and how long does the trial take, and how much does it cost? Like, how do you sort of force rank those things? And is there a general set of priorities you think comes first, or is it really tailored to the individual?
I mean, I think it's always going to be tailored to the individual. I think it also depends on where the company is in their kind of life cycle. Are they looking for, right, that first program to really prove that the technology works and kind of de-risk the platform versus second, third program where they're thinking about really kind of expanding to broader patient populations, larger commercial opportunity. So that definitely plays into the extent to which you might value, right, ease of kind of early clinical development, the kind of strength of association between a certain biomarker that will give you kind of high confidence that that will translate into meaningful, right, kind of real outcomes for patients in later stages of development. So I think depending on where the company is and also, right, what therapeutic areas they might have, existing expertise in, as well as kind of what their funding, situation is like, what the funding environment is like, that might impact kind of what they want to prioritize and kind of how much they're willing to invest upfront before thinking about expanding once we see some de-risking signals.
Makes sense. And maybe a question for you. So like you put yourself in the shoes of the operator for a minute. You made the smart choice of bringing in Matt. He helped you realize what your top 5 programs could be. Quite a spectrum of investments, timelines to realization. How do you wrestle with what you do first versus how you try to do all of it in parallel process? And how does that interplay work out sort of at an enterprise strategy level?
Yeah, I think this question's honestly, the answer to this question has evolved over time, right? When money was flowing, I think a lot of times what we're thinking about, how do we really capitalize on the resources that are available? We were supporting organizations building very comprehensive portfolio strategies, really thinking through, let's say using the gene therapy example, what are all the range of tissue types that we could target? What are the near-term targets, longer-term targets? I think more and more, as we're advising organizations, we're really thinking about how can we be more focused. So really, what are opportunities for getting to earlier proof of principle, early inflection points for any given opportunity? Honestly, building on a lot of what Matt just said, right? Where do we have conviction around our platform being differentiated? So how do we show that as quickly as possible? Increasing the expectation is showing that in clinic. So what are the given indications that can help us show that within the clinic? But also being mindful that I think what we've seen is, everyone chases the same targets. As soon as one company is going after a given indication, others are going to follow pretty quickly. So also being mindful of where will you continue to have differentiation, but also where is there sufficient need, both clinical unmet need, as Matt said, but also sufficient patient numbers in order to not only support the clinical trials, but having something that is viable commercially at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's well said. A quick question maybe to follow up, because I know you and I have like tag team some of these where I'll come from the investor lens, and I feel like you're right. Like a couple of years ago, you could raise a couple $100 million and we're going to do all of it. And now it's really not viable to go that road financially.
Well, that's smart, right? Because people were publishing then like 10 indications that they were doing, and very quickly they weren't the only ones in those 10 indications anymore. It actually doesn't.
Well, and on top of that too, I feel like we've seen so many times, no matter how much capital you have, the idea of hiring 10 separate clinical teams and 10 separate program leads, all world-class high quality, like it's just not really viable, right? And the amount of dilution you take on in your cap table as an early company to raise that level is also, it was hard then and it's even worse now. So how do you think about it? Let's say there's a world where like we could go after oncology, immunology, and CVMed. Like, do we try to do all 3? Do we pick one, double down on that, and try to partner the rest to throw off free cash flow? Like, how do you wrestle with the interplay so you don't leave value on the table, but you also don't overextend?
Yeah. So there's a lot of it depends in that question. I do think it really depends on where your platform has the opportunity to be differentiated and have enduring differentiation. I would typically say that prosecuting oneself across multiple therapeutic areas probably is not super viable, but we have seen many organizations perhaps we've seen many organizations in a smart way think about what can we prosecute ourselves to at least post proof of concept. What are other indications where we know through strategic conversations there's interest, and perhaps we can bring it to IND and we can create opportunity or capitalize on resources for us and also potentially learn, right, through that journey. But it really depends on if that partnership is going to be a distraction, right? Like you have to be super honest with oneself. What is the mind share of the organization? What is the experience and expertise of the organization? Are we able to truly parallel path? And we've seen that story play out differently for different organizations. We've seen some do it really well to have risk mitigation from that, and we've seen others really spread themselves too thin. And one could argue that it was the reason that they weren't able to prosecute other things quickly enough.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think too, one of the challenges that also happens in this space all the time is when you rush to broaden the technology. I think there's such a pressure when you take on private capital to get to a value inflection point, to show clinically that we're making progress, to get a product into the marketplace. And I have suggested for some time now, when you looked at the very earliest AAV programs, for example, that got into rare disease populations, those were not optimized AAV technologies, and the volume of extra chromosomal DNA going into these patients, it's not surprising that you started to see off-target safety effects, and that's created some regulatory overlay. Maybe this is a good transition point. I do think what sort of happened to the field, and tell me if you guys agree, is that some of those early technologies got out there and they didn't scale the way we thought, and there was more regulatory pressure to go to broad indications. Like take the AAV example, right? Like so many companies spent $100 million to build these facilities. They had to sell for $15 million 5 years later to make vaccines because they couldn't monetize the platforms themselves. And I feel like part of the challenge was these early technologies were not optimized to broader applications, and the FDA pushed back against it. But now do you guys agree? Then are we starting to see that change, Max? Like there's been the guidance from the FDA on platform technologies again. The current administration's been out there talking a lot about trying to help cell and gene and get into rare disease again. How does that regulatory landscape change? And are we coming out of a period that's been difficult into a period that could be more opportunistic and receptive towards these innovative technologies?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple different pieces there. I think the first has more to do with kind of the upfront manufacturing investment, which I think is driven by, right, just funding environment that made that feasible, 5-10 years ago, which also led to increased competition because more companies could raise money, more competition for scarce, effective manufacturing, CDMO type resources,
Talent,
which
yeah.
I think
People weren't there.
led folks to make that decision where if we're going to make this viable as a company, we need to invest in our own manufacturing, and many went that route kind of out of necessity. And I think we've seen that shift the other direction. I mean, definitely still a number of companies that are investing in their own cell and gene therapy manufacturing capabilities. When we started looking at, I think, the broader shift towards non-viral approaches in the gene therapy space, and more gene editing, right? That's definitely something where, right, more scalable, safer, lower COGS, and just given also the infrastructure that needed to be put in place for mRNA vaccines and LNP development, has really kind of accelerated that. Where not that it's not going to be a challenge, but much less critical component to success of those companies relative to companies developing viral-based therapies. So I think that's one piece more on the kind of manufacturing investment side of things. When it comes to regulatory, you mentioned the kind of platform designation, which I think gets us to an interesting topic around kind of why platforms are valuable at all, right? There's the differentiation of the products they enable. There's the ability to address new targets that historically have been challenging. But there's also the repeatability of the platform in terms of being able to have your second and third and fourth product, get to market faster, be less expensive to develop, higher PTRS, create just kind of a broader, I think, halo around the platform and the company in terms of how you're perceived, by the clinical community, by patients, et cetera. Also, talent, being a key component there. So I think that does raise an interesting question, kind of tying back to how we think about deploying resources, because you don't really fully capture the value of the platform until you get to that second, third, and fourth program. So the kind of broader you spread yourself early, the kind of more money and resource you have to spend to get to that first inflection point where you start to kind of see some more returns there. So I think there's definitely a trade-off there. But on the kind of platform designation piece specifically, I think that's definitely one helpful component that will further, improve, speed and reduce costs associated with, platform development. Just for those who may not be familiar, the general guidance from the FDA is that certain components of preclinical data for a platform therapy can be reused for different products coming from that same platform that are, have similar components. So for example, if you use the same, viral vector across two programs, you can reuse some of the same, toxicology biodistribution data from the first program when you're, submitting any sort of regulatory filings related to the second program. So that can help you get into the clinic faster, get there more efficiently, kind of fewer repeat experiments. So definitely something that I think will be helpful for those that are already pursuing platforms. Probably not going to make or break whether or not companies, large pharma, are investing in platforms or interested in acquiring platforms, but just one more point in favor towards, platforms. I think having some value beyond simply the individual products that they create.
No, it's super helpful, and I think the clarification on what is and isn't in that FDA guidance is really helpful. And in some ways, it seems like it's potentially on the margin in terms of like the portability of certain non-therapeutic translational evidence being packaged. But I do think it speaks to a trend we see more and more, which is this current administration. Look, we all realize pros and cons on many different directions, but certainly expressing an open willingness to support and partner with innovative platform technologies. Tim, have you seen the same? Like I've even heard that they're doing like executive by executive level engagement at the top of the FDA to try and like identify programs that can help accelerate. Is this a turning of the tide that actually supports reinvestment in this category? And how have you thought about that for ultra orphan versus more broad but still biologically linked disease populations?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen increased interest. If we think about like some of the pros from the administration, there's definitely interest in supporting rare diseases, right, and exploring how that could occur, and potentially, reducing some of the regulatory burden when we think about patient populations that are very hard to study in. I think about whether long term that is viable from a commercial strategy perspective. It will vary depending on the technology. If it's a one-time technology versus, there's long-term value captured from any given opportunity. I mean, we've seen creative models even recently where we see nonprofits starting to explore how they can contribute to this space, and potentially, capitalize on some of the innovative technologies that are out there. So I think we're seeing people really try to explore what are ways that we can bring what are just really exciting technologies to patients where there's truly unmet need, right? But the business model is challenging. If I think about like commercial viability and where strategics are looking, that's probably still something that is less exciting on that front. They're probably still looking for, I think the current trend is still looking for less monogenic, bigger populations, or at least on the rare side, the less ultra rare. But I think coupled with that are regulatory as well as, patient advocacy trends that might enable at least opportunities to prove technologies and realize, the value of medicine in some of those patient populations.
No, super helpful. Well, guys, this has been great. We've covered a lot of ground. Maybe I'll just summarize, make sure I'm hearing what you said correctly. I do think, Matt, you started us off. When you really think about first steps of the technology like this, it's really pinning down how are we advancing therapeutic science relative to precedent, and what does that unlock at a molecular level that couldn't be done historically? That defines your rope fence of where you can move the needle on therapeutic potential relative to precedent technologies. Within that, I think I heard from both of you, don't try to do everything at once. There's no way you could possibly scale an organization to do it. Focus on the areas where you have biological mitigation, but do have sort of a threshold of commercial viability attached to that. so that there is a reward at the end of the rainbow, if you will, that could ultimately create an exit opportunity, create a return on investment, or create a durable value potential of free cash flow to then fund subsequently programs 2, 3, 4, and et cetera. Guys, this has been helpful. I appreciate you guys taking the time. Hopefully, folks listening at home, you can tell we've spent a lot of time wrestling with exactly these questions. Optimism that this is a sign from the FDA and from regulators that we're going to get back to a period of greater permissivity. And with that, capital unlocked to really advance innovative technologies for patients who really need it. So I want to thank you both for joining today. For folks listening at home, if you have questions, reach out to any of us. We'd love to find time to talk more. Otherwise, stay tuned for our next ClearView Convo.